Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message. Take your Bible and turn with me to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. We're going to begin our reading today in verse 34. The disciples have come back after their commissioning and they're sending out. The apostles have been sent out. They've come back now and they're telling Jesus all that has happened. They're excited to tell him. And Jesus says, well, it's time for you guys to take a break. So you look there in verse 31, Jesus says, come apart, he says. Rest a while. So he wanted his disciples to rest. So they get into the boat and they go on to the other side. And in verse 33, the people were smarter than they knew. They saw them go and knew it was Jesus in the boat, and they ran. They ran from one side of the lake to the other. And while they were running, they were telling people, Jesus is going to be over there. And so they were picking up their crowd as they were going. So it's like a snowball, growing as they run around the lake. And when they get to the other side, guess what? The people are already there. That's a fast run. So they run to the other side. They meet Jesus. And so we're going to begin here in verse 34. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion toward them because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far spent. Send them away that they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. He answered and said unto them, give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? He saith unto them, how many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say, 5 and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they all did eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fishes. And they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. Well, we encounter something familiar to us here in the Gospel of Mark, and that is the compassion of Jesus. You notice it says in verse 34, when Jesus came out, he saw much people and was moved with compassion. Well, Mark is very, very quick to tell us about the compassion of Christ. In chapter 1, in verse 41, Jesus was moved with compassion with the leper. Remember that story? He put forth his hand and touched him and said unto him, I will, be thou clean. In Mark chapter 5, Jesus was moved with compassion. Again, when we were told about the demoniac, he wanted to go with Jesus. Jesus said, howbeit Jesus suffered him not, and said to him, go home to thy friends and tell them how great things the Lord hath done for thee, and hath had compassion on thee. So here we have it again, the word compassion. And this isn't going to be the last time here in 634 that we see that Jesus has compassion. We see this again and again, and especially in Mark. Mark loves to tell about the compassion of Christ. And so here in verse 34, even though they had gone to the other side, and their purpose in going to the other side was to rest. He wanted the disciples. Look back in 31. He said, come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. So they're going to a desert place was on purpose, and the point of it was for the disciples to take a break. They had been out 2 by 2, had come back, and they were excited, but they were exhausted, and Jesus says, it's time for you guys to have a little retreat, just to get apart. Now, when we read the word desert, immediately what pops in our mind is a place like a desert, right? Dry, arid, dusty, no vegetation to speak of, maybe some cactuses around, or cacti or whatever. It's scattered about, and lots of rocks. However, desert here just means it was deserted. There was no people there, which was the point. Jesus didn't want his disciples being around a lot of people. They needed to be apart. They needed to be alone so they could recharge. They needed to be with Jesus so that they could recharge. And so that was the idea. When they get there, they're in a desert place already. That was their designation. That was their goal. And they got to a desert place on the other side of the lake, a place where there were no people. And I'm sure that it was a lovely place. It was probably grassy, and there were probably lots of plants, and it was probably lovely. It was just deserted. And that's the idea here. And so they come out of the boat. Jesus sees the people, and he's moved with compassion. Now, verse 34 really comprises probably a lot of time. We probably have a lot that's going on here. He's moved with compassion because they're sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So they come out of the boat, Jesus sees the people, and he gathers them together so that he can begin teaching. And he teaches, and he teaches, and he teaches, and we don't know exactly all that was said at this moment, although we can imagine, looking back at some of the parables and the other things that he taught, that he's teaching them about the kingdom of God, and he's teaching them about the coming kingdom and so forth. He's doing all of that, and then verse 35, these poor disciples have been neglected. Verse 35, when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place. Now the time is far past. Notice that they lead with, and of course we know what they said because we've already read it, but they lead with a manipulation of place and time. There's nothing here, and it's late in the day. So they're going to give Jesus a suggestion. But notice verse 36, it's not really a suggestion, it's a command. Send them away. We didn't want to be around these guys anyway. It's late. This place is desert. They're just exhausted. And they say, Jesus, just send them away. Let them go. And then, of course, they give the reason. That they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. So they say, send them away. The apostles think to help Jesus with the problem. They think it's a problem. They see it as a problem. They don't want to be around these folks anymore. They need a time of rest. But Jesus sees it as an opportunity. Now, the reason they say is that they may go into the country round about and into the villages. But the question, I think, for us is, does the world's store hold anything that can satisfy the hungry soul? They're thinking about their bellies. Jesus is thinking about something else. These men, his apostles, need a lesson in what can truly satisfy. They think that they've got it figured out. They know how to get rid of the people. They know the reason. The reason is there's nothing here. Send them out to buy something. Notice the assumed ability of the disciples, or of the people, by the disciples. They say, and buy themselves bread. So has the sinner any ability to rectify his or her situation? Can they really truly buy themselves bread? The answer is no. And just on a human level, just on a fleshly level, did these people, do every one of these people that are there on the seaside with Jesus have the money to go someplace and buy themselves bread? Nobody knows the answer to that question. You can't know. There's 5,000 men. How can you know that every single family can go and find a place to buy bread and have the money to do it? So they assume something very large. Spiritually speaking, they assume something impossible, because the sinner can never rectify his or her situation by their own ability. It can't be done. And even then, to have the money to buy food for themselves was also a huge assumption. And the problem is, of course, at the end of their argument, they have nothing to eat. So the disciples don't know it yet, but the crowd is in a good space with this problem. The disciples think it's a bad space. The disciples think the desert place and the late hour and the fact that they're hungry means that there's a problem here. But there's not really a problem here. And the disciples just don't know it, but Jesus does. And so we begin with the pressure being put on the scenario, the pressure of the disciples not knowing, the pressure of Jesus knowing. But Jesus knows something that the disciples don't. He knows what he's about to do, and he knows that the disciples need to learn a lesson. So this is another, I think I titled last week's lesson, How to Train an Apostle. This is How to Train an Apostle number 2. This is the second lesson. Their second lesson is in dependence. In dependence, not independence, but this lesson is in the subject of dependence. So, they give Jesus a command, send them away. They give him the reason. They need to go to the country roundabout in the villages and buy themselves bread. They assume the ability of these people to do just that, which is a false assumption. And then they state the problem. They're hungry. They have nothing to eat. And this is going to be a problem. Okay, so what does Jesus do? Jesus takes another opportunity to train his men. Notice what he says. Give ye them to eat. This is not, they are not communicating well, are they? They are not communicating well. Give ye them to eat. That's not what the disciples wanted to hear. The disciples have it all figured out. Send them away. We don't want them around here anymore. That's underlying, that's the thing they're thinking, I think. We don't want them here. And besides, it's late. And besides, this is a desert place. And besides, they need to go buy something for themselves because they don't have anything to eat, Jesus. So let's get rid of the people. And Jesus says, how about you take care of this? They told Jesus, send them away. Jesus says, ye give them something to eat. So this was not a welcome suggestion, but it was a necessary suggestion because the disciples have a lesson to learn. Would this be the way they behaved after Christ ascended? What about Peter at the beautiful gate and the man who was lame on his feet? What is he going to do if he doesn't learn this lesson? You remember that story? Peter and John are going to the temple to pray at the hour of prayer, and they see the man who's lame at the temple gate begging, and Peter looks at him and says, I don't have silver and gold, but what I have, I give unto thee. You see, Jesus said here, give ye them to eat. This was a lesson that was going to be a life lesson for these men. You do this. Now, of course, if Peter didn't learn this lesson, imagine him at the gate with John, and they see the man there with the who had the lame feet, and he's begging. What if Peter tried to leverage what others had to help the lame man at the gate of the temple? What if he said, listen, why don't you hobble down over there and see Dr. So-and-so and maybe he can help you? No. That wasn't the thing that Jesus wanted to teach his disciples. Is the church to depend on the stores of the world to meet the spiritual needs of the hearts of the people of the world? Absolutely not. The church is the only dispenser of life. The gospel is the message of life. The Christ we preach is the King of life. He is the giver of life. We have what they need. We're not to send them out to somebody else. Why don't you go down the street? Maybe they can help you. The church is the one that has to do this work. And so these disciples need to understand that. They said, send them away. Jesus said, ye give them something to eat. Give ye them to eat. Okay. So they say unto him, shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? This, of course, is a rhetorical question. Not one of the disciples is suggesting that such a thing happened. The command of Jesus to them seems simply ridiculous. They don't have this kind of money anyway. So them asking this question, shall we give them 200 penny worth of bread, is just for them to say, that's just dumb. Why? We can't do that. What are we going to do? Give them 200 penny worth of bread? We don't even have 200 penny worth of bread. It doesn't matter. 5,000 men. Look at this crowd. We can't feed them. That's what they're saying to Jesus. But they're saying it in kind of a snarky way. Shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread? Yeah, they didn't have that kind of money anyway, so it didn't matter. Them saying it, and of course Jesus, bless his heart. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't the patience of the Lord so good? I don't know about you, but he had to be really patient with me this week. What do you think? Did he have to be patient with you? I think so. I think we're all grateful for this, because sometimes I give him snarky answers too. Sometimes I say things that I shouldn't even say, I was praying this week, and one of the prayers of David, he talks about his mouth. He says, keep a guard on my mouth. And then he talks about his lips. And then he goes from that, keep a guard on my mouth, and then he talks about the heart. And he says, incline my heart to your way. Because, it's the issues of the heart that feed the mouth. From the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. What's in your heart abundantly? You see. And sometimes I say snarky things because in my heart, guess what? There's snarky things. Sometimes I say prideful things because guess what? In my heart, there's a whole lot of pride. Sometimes I say dark things because guess what? Sometimes in my heart, there's dark things. And guess where they come out of? Your mouth will always reveal what's inside. Always reveals what's inside. And so the disciples, shall we go and buy 200 penny? Well, they just reveal to Jesus what they don't believe. They can't help these people. They don't have enough money. There's not enough bread. None of that. And of course, Jesus, bless his heart, he's so patient here with these men. Notice verse 38. He said unto them, how many loaves have ye? So Jesus doesn't rebuke them because he wants to teach them, just like he wants to teach us. And he asks some strategically positioned questions, or a strategically positioned question followed by a simple command. Notice, he said unto them, how many loaves have ye? Now, Jesus rejects the country and the villages idea. So first thing they said to Jesus was, send them away. Jesus says, give ye them to eat. The second thing they said was that they may go to the country round about and to the villages. Jesus said, how many loaves have ye? So he rejects completely this idea that they're to go to the country and the villages and blah, blah, blah. What a good question this is. The church must ask this question in every generation. What do we have? What do we have? What is it that the Lord has given us the ability to do? Every congregation and every different place, wherever the Lord has planted a church, has its own unique personality and ability and style. Every one of them. Because it's a unique blend of people that makes a body called the church. And so here at Creek Road Baptist Church, we have that same thing. We have a unique personality. We have a unique style. We have individuals that make up this congregation that bring to it all sorts of things. Jesus wants to know of the disciples, just a simple question, because we're talking about bread. How many loaves do you have? I think this is a good question that we must ask ourselves. What is it that I have? What is it that the Lord has given me that I now can give back? And then he says this. He gives them this command. Go and see. Jesus was commanded by the disciples to send them away. He follows that up with a command to them. Give ye them to eat. They said, send them out to the country and into the villages. Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? They said that they may buy themselves bread. And Jesus said to them, go and see. Here's the command. Don't think for a moment that this is only for the apostles, because it's not. It is for us. We too must evaluate who we are, what we have, what the Lord has given us, and go and see what it is. Now, I would imagine the disciples had an idea, but they didn't want to think about that because they didn't want to deal with all these people. Send them away. That was their idea. Let them buy themselves some food. They were done with it. Jesus says, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And he would say that very thing to us. We too are to take stock of what it is that we have. What do you have? And let me ask you a question. Are you clutching it tightly? Is it your precious treasure, not to be released ever? That is a problem. Jesus wants to know the entire story. He doesn't want to know what you've got laid in reserve, and he doesn't know what you have that you can liquefy quickly. He wants to know the whole story, from zero to whatever it is. How many? The whole thing. Because whatever you keep reserved for yourself, ladies and gentlemen, is nothing but a dead idol. Go and see. Now, the disciples. I love these guys. I think I love these guys so much because I see myself in them. I see us in them. Notice what happens here. When they knew, they say 5. You notice that they don't even say, oh, Jesus, we have only 5 loaves. They didn't even say 5 of what? They're just so disgusted. They just say 5. 5 and 2 fishes. The honest evaluation of the store turns up a low count. Of course it did. How long did it take them to count 7 things? How long did it take 12 guys to count 7 things? Did they have to form a committee? What's going on here? That when they knew, they probably searched the entire boat, because that's their place of residence at the moment, is the boat. They probably climbed in the boat, and they're searching through stuff. Well, here's a loaf. Well, here's a loaf. Well, here's a fish. I don't know if I want to eat this or not. Here's a loaf. And they found it. 5. They come back and say 5 and 2 fish. Yeah, this is okay. And that's okay, right? This is an honest evaluation. And it's okay. It's okay that it's a low count, 5 and 2 fish. It's okay that they come back with a little bit of an attitude. That's okay. It's all okay, because they have done what Jesus asked them to do. They went and they saw and they come back with a report. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when Jesus tells us, you and me, to go and see, he doesn't expect a wonderful count. He knows it's going to be low, because he knows who we are and where we've been and what we know and what we've got. He knew before they went, which is why he's given them this little training here. He knew it would be low. Well, but so if it's 5, what if it's 12? What if it's 24? What if it's 36? What difference does it matter when you're facing 5,000 hungry mouths? It could be 100 loaves. It don't matter. It's not enough. There's no way what they have is going to be enough. No way. And when you go and see, when you count, you will find that it is not enough to meet the need that Jesus has commanded you to meet. So, an honest evaluation of the store turns up a low count. That's okay. Jesus wanted them to realize that they couldn't take care of things in their strength. Now, notice how contrary this is to his command. He said to them, give ye them to eat, but they can't. They go and make an honest count of what they've got. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Not enough. No way. But Jesus still, his command is in force. Give ye them to eat. What do you do when you have a low count and the command of Christ to meet a need? What do you do? Well, you can't change this. You can't change the command. That's going to always be in place. And you can't change your store, because it's never going to be enough. And you're not going to send them out someplace else, because that will never take care of the problem. So what do you do when you have a low store and a command of Christ to meet a need? Well, we're going to find out, aren't we? So, verse 39. Jesus doesn't say a word, does he? 5 and 2 fishes. Verse 39. He commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. In verse 40, they sat down in ranks by hundreds and fifties. Now you can just imagine the disciples going out into this massive congregation of 5,000, and they had to group them in companies by hundreds and fifties. So there's a lot of groups, a lot of pods all over this hillside. It's filled with people. And now they've grouped them up. Jesus gives them a command, and he says to them, you make them sit down. So the disciples not only have been commanded to give them something to eat, but now Jesus says, in that larger commandscape, give them something to eat. Number one, you're going to have them sit on the grass. So this is exactly the opposite of what the disciples told Jesus to do. They told Jesus in verse 36 to send them away. Jesus tells the apostles, have them sit down. Have them sit down. And do it in companies. So the disciples have work to do. Number one, they're going to make them sit. The disciples work. And what does Jesus do? Notice that this is the only thing that Jesus does in the entire piece, except work with his disciples. But this is the only thing he does. Verse 41. And when he had taken of the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples. So when he lifted these loaves and the fish up and had his blessing, and he brought his hands back down, there's still just 5 loaves and 2 fish. But he gave them to the disciples. So what do you do with a low store? What do you do when you have a command and you have a low store? You give it to Jesus, and he multiplies it. And I think every one of us in here can tell stories. Every one of us, we can all, everyone, one by one, march up here behind this pulpit and speak into this mic and tell of a time when we had nothing. There was no way we could meet our need. And suddenly the Lord took it and just multiplied it. He did a work. Every one of us can tell a story like that. We know this happens. And the lesson for us in those moments is to depend on Jesus in the next moment when we don't have enough. And in the next moment when we don't have enough. And in the next moment when we don't have enough. Because then suddenly we realize that miracles are still happening. Jesus is still doing his work. He's still feeding multitudes, and he's using the little bit that we have to do an overwhelming work. $346 for the state of Ohio. Is that enough? Is that going to reach everybody in the state of Ohio? Nope. But guess what? We gave it to Jesus. And that money will do an overwhelming work amongst the multitudes in Ohio. And so every church, depending on the Lord, is going to do the very same thing. They're going to give their little bit because it's never going to be enough, and they're going to put it in the hands of Jesus, and Jesus is going to say, thank you. Here's what I'm going to do with what you have. Yeah. So he commanded them to make them all sit down, and then he blesses the fish and the bread and then gives them to the disciples. Again, the disciples are put to work. Notice there in verse 41, and gave them to the disciples to set before them. Now they've already divided them up into companies. Now the disciples, they're not ushers any longer, they're waiters. And so they're given the fish and the bread, and they're going off in their, I'm sure they still have the same little sections of the crowd, each one going to their sections, their hundreds and their fifties, and they're handing out the bread and the fish. The disciples, again, are working. This is exactly opposite of what the disciples asked Jesus to do. They are giving rather than the people buying. The disciples had 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's it. They gave it to Jesus. Jesus gave it back to the disciples, and the disciples are now giving to the people exactly what Jesus had told them to do. Give ye them to eat. So they're doing it now. They're actually serving the people with what is not enough, and yet what Christ has made more than enough. And notice verse 42. They did all eat and were filled. Wait a minute. 5 loaves and 2 fishes doesn't fill and doesn't allow 5,000 people plus to eat. And they're not going to be full after that, even if everyone got just a little bitty bite. It's not enough. But when you give it to Jesus, it's more than enough. They did all eat and were filled. So the problem of verse 36 is solved. Verse 36 says, they have nothing to eat. Guess what? They had so much to eat, they were full, and we're going to find out there was some left over. Now, notice verse 43. And they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments. So the disciples, who's doing this? Jesus going around doing that? No, the disciples are. So not only did they make them sit down, but they gave the food to Jesus. He blessed it. They gave it back to the people. And once the people were full, they went back through the field and they picked up all that was left. 12 baskets. And of course, the 12 baskets full is not lost on us, is it? Because there's 12 apostles. And they all needed to understand this lesson. But this is not just for the apostles, it is also for us. Our little bit, our inadequate bit, is enough when put in the hands of Christ to feed a multitude. So he gives us a command. Go and see. What do you have? You say, well, I don't have 5 loaves and 2 fish, but I do have, what is it? Do you have time? Do you have money? Do you have talent? Do you have property? Do you have ability? What is it that you have? Only you can take stock of what it is you have. And ladies and gentlemen, only you can give it to Jesus. And when that happens, a miracle will take place. I promise you, every time. Verse 44 ends the passage and tells us that they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. And of course we know that there's more than just men here. This wasn't a men's retreat. They had run around the top of that lake, and as they went through the cities and villages that were along the shore of the lake, they were telling everybody, Jesus is going to land over there in that desert spot. Come with us. And so there were moms and dads, there were children, teenagers, there were grandmas and grandpas. Everybody had done it. It was a multi generational group. Men, women, boys, girls, all ages, there to hear Jesus teach. 5,000 men, yes. Maybe these are the heads of the families that they counted. But, 5,000 probably means 15,000, maybe 20,000, maybe 30,000. Who knows how many? That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. And they were all, notice verse 42, they all ate, they were all full, and there was enough left over to fill 12 baskets. This is the lesson. How to train an apostle. Maybe we should change this today. This is not just for the apostles. This is for us. How to train a disciple. We too, ladies and gentlemen, need to stop depending on the store of the world and start depending on our Christ. Hallelujah.
Jesus will meet you.
Thanks for listening to this week's message. Please join us again next time for another installment of the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit.